Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you. Welcome back to the 2020 Washington Conference on the Americas. As you see, we're going to have a wonderful conversation today with Secretary Seade. I'm Eric Farnsworth, the Council Vice President, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time again today to join us for what promises to be an outstanding plenary session. As before, our 2020 Washington Conference on the Americas is made possible by presenting sponsors Chevron, General Motors, and Merck, and by our gold sponsors, including Chiquita Brands, Freeport McMoran, Integra Capital, MetLife, Principal Financial Group, Repsol, and Sempra Energy. And our media partner remains the Financial Times, and we are deeply indebted to each one of you, and we thank you for your continued support. Mr. Secretary, before I formally welcome and introduce you, we are delighted to have the opportunity to mark the fourth 2020 conference plenary session with a very short video, which includes reflections from a former co-host of the conference and a long-standing friend of the Council of the Americas and a friend of mine, and indeed a mentor of mine personally, Ambassador Alec Watson, a former Assistant Secretary of State, Ambassador to Peru, Senior Foreign Service Officer, a leader in the global environmental movement in the private sector, and a friend to many of us on the line. Alec has truly done it all. He is one of the many senior officials at the State Department who have worked closely with us to make this conference such a success for over 50 years. And indeed, the current acting Assistant Secretary of State, Michael Kozak, has done a wonderful job with us as well this year, and we thank him for his support. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Alec Watson.
I'd like to say a few words to you today about the Council of the Americas Conference on the Americas that has been going on for many, many years since it was initiated by David Rockefeller shortly after he set up the Council. I am Alexander Watson, and I had the privilege to serve as Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs in the first government of President Bill Clinton. And for us, coming in as a new administration following the Republican administration of George H.W. Bush, the conference was a very useful place for us to be able to lay out how we propose to deal with our relationships with our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. And it was a good opportunity for the business community to hear directly from the policymakers in the new administration, and also for the new administration's policymakers to get good questions and comments and opinions from leading members of the business community. When we came in, we built on the excellent work done by the George H.W. Bush administration in the Western Hemisphere, led by Secretary of State Jim Baker and my predecessor as Assistant Secretary, Bernie Aronson. My subsequent boss, Carla Hills, as USTR, they had negotiated the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas. The new administration, in order to make sure that we could get this through Congress, added two corollary arrangements on labor and the environment. Then we worked furiously to get the NAFTA agreement through the Congress. Then we built on that. The idea was to try to create a free trade area of the Americas. And to launch that, Vice President Al Gore went to Mexico after NAFTA had been approved and called for a summit of the Americas in 1994. And so we did that with a focus on strengthening democracy throughout the hemisphere, free market economies, concentrating on alleviating poverty and other social ills, and also trying to start to focus the attention of the hemisphere on our mutual interests in sound environmental policy. So working on the basis of what we inherited from the Bush administration and what we saw as the chief objectives, opportunities in the future, we set the task. But one of the first things we did was work with the Council of the Americas in bringing together all the right folks to attend the Conference of the Americas. President Clinton attended, Vice President Gore attended, of course Secretary of State Warren Christopher attended, Secretary of the Treasury, Benson, attended. Every year, the USTR attended. We also brought in key players from around the hemisphere, such as the finance ministers of both Brazil and Mexico, and the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. And as far as I was concerned, these were really important events in my time as Assistant Secretary in terms of getting people to focus at the highest level of our government on the questions of Latin America when they have multiple demands on their time, and also giving the business community a chance to deal with these folks directly on these issues and to express their views. So the Council of the Americas keeps rolling on every year, doing its good work. This year, unfortunately, it's going to be a virtual conference, but it will still have great value. And I hope that all of you who see this little message will give careful consideration to attending its sessions. Thanks very much. Bye.
We thank you, Alec, for those terrific comments and your words of support, and indeed your strong support through the years, and all the Assistant Secretaries of State. Well, in our inter-American circles, Dr. Jesús Seade needs no introduction, but he certainly deserves one. As an academic, diplomat, PhD economist from Oxford, no less, and a chemical engineer by training, Undersecretary Seade has distinguished himself as a practitioner in the worlds of trade and finance over several decades. He served as a negotiator in the talks that led to the creation of the WTO and as Deputy Secretary General there. He was a senior advisor at the IMF during a critical period of debt relief for several major economies, including Argentina and Brazil, as well as 15 highly indebted poorer countries. And of course, Ambassador Seade was the lead negotiator for Mexico on the updated North American trade agreement that went into effect just last month. As we know, in the United States, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA. Given his mix of experience and innovative work on trade, it is no wonder that the Mexican government put forward his candidacy to lead the WTO into a new era. So we've asked the Undersecretary to speak with us today about his vision for the future of global and regional trade at this pivotal moment, not only for the WTO, but also for the global economy. We also welcome the Ambassador of Mexico, Martha Bárcena. Ambassador, we welcome you and appreciate your presence with us today. After the Undersecretary's comments, we hope to have some time for some reactions and interactions with you, the audience members. And so if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on the WebEx here and send a message to host and presenter. That's host and presenter. And we will attempt to take as many questions as we are able to do. Please also note that this session today is on the record and it is open to the media. Ambassador Seade, it is a real pleasure to have you with us back at the Council of the Americas. Thank you for joining us during your very busy schedule. Over to you for your initial thoughts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Farnsworth. It's a great honor. I would like to thank, first of all, the American Society, Council of the Americas for this invitation, this distinction. I would like to thank all the audience to be there under the testing, trying conditions we have to face, both in conducting this conference in our private lives. Horrible times, but it's a pleasure to be with you. In particular, I would like to acknowledge and thank for her presence Ambassador Bárcena, my co-national, Susan Siegel, a number of other personalities with you. I will not go through the invidious exercise of mentioning many of them, but I'm really honored to have your ear. As has been mentioned, I am a candidate for the WTO Director General position. The WTO is not at all in a normal state of affairs. It's in a dire crisis. It's a quadruple crisis, I think. Two aspects of crisis that are internal to WTO are the fact that coming from the multilateral trading system created after the Second World War with the GATT, the heart of the GATT were the negotiations that were conducted every 5 years, every 8 years, opening markets and also creating rules to face the new needs that arose, the new situations that were faced. And it worked very well until we came to the crowning jewel of that process, which was the creation of the WTO in 1995. But since then, we have had extremely little to show by way of negotiations. There's been a small, important, but very narrow result on prohibition of export subsidies in agriculture. There's been a trade facilitation agreement and a few other things. But by and large, there hasn't been enough negotiation. And as a result of that, electronic trade, e-trade, electronic commerce doesn't exist in the WTO agreements. Countries as important as China or also Vietnam or Russia or many others were not part of those negotiations. So everything was negotiated by part of the countries out there in the world trading with each other, but not by many others also out there. With those, we negotiated accession protocols, but that's never a substitute for having a really comprehensive approach to common problems with everybody. One result of the lack of negotiations is that we don't have the rules we need, and all the weight has fallen on dispute resolution. The judges, the people conducting the panels and then the appeals, the appellate body, have had to shoulder the burden of not having enough guidance provided by negotiations that have not existed. And as a result of that weight, the appellate body has gone out of circulation. Since a number of years, a number of countries, but particularly the United States in the lead, but not alone, have voiced their concerns that the appellate body was developing a bit too much inclination to de facto jurisprudence that is not provided for in the agreements, but that nevertheless began to develop for some reasons that I will touch on in a moment. So in the end, a number of countries have expressed their dissatisfaction. The US in a very strong way that has led the US to block the appointment and reappointment of appellate body members, which instead of being 7 are done now to 1, and you need at least 3 to operate, so it's non-operational. So that's the double crisis in the WTO: no negotiations and no appellate body. But on top of that comes the pandemic that has created absolute chaos, total disruption on trade across the world, and the major and worsening dispute between the United States and China that, of course, spills over directly and also in terms of bad environment to the rest of the world. So the WTO is in a dire crisis and it needs to come out of it. Under those conditions, on top of the crisis, we have the fact that the main instrument that is the ministerial conference that should take place every 2 years is now, if at all, hopefully taking place in June next year after 4 years. So with a lot of pent-up pressure for decisions and for business. And finally comes the resignation of the current Director General announced this May. So we need to deal with all that crisis. And let me just briefly tell you why I hope the members of the WTO elect this humble servant and friend of the system that Mexico has put forward as a candidate. I am convinced that to get anywhere with the WTO, we need 3 things. A strong negotiator that can lead the charge, that can lead the process to break impasses, to break the sequence of interminable grandstanding by ministers in some negotiations that are on the way, like on fisheries. We have negotiations since 2001, and they are due to finish this year, but not for sure, because things are stuck in many directions. We need a forceful hand to challenge obstructionist positions, not to advance any particular position. We need an honest broker, but a forceful broker that will generate movement. We need such a personality and experience of a negotiator. Also, we need, despite what many claim, that we don't need expertise, that comes from the technicians. That's absolute rubbish, if I may say, because if you're going to play a role leading this situation out of the hole where it finds itself, you need to be able to sit with a formidable negotiator for the Europeans, Phil Hogan, the formidable negotiator for the United States, Ambassador Lighthizer, with the formidable representatives of China in particular, and then also Japan, India, and be with them and engage in discussion where they have to move, but you have to help them. And if you don't know what they're talking about, if you don't know what the agreements, not just say the letter, which my assistant could tell me, but where they come from, what they mean, what are the delicate balances there. If I don't know that, in 30 seconds of discussion, the Director General will be sidelined. So we need a strong negotiator that has delivered results. We need an expert. And finally, we need somebody that has an established relationship with the different players around the world. And I personally have lived in Europe more than I have lived in Mexico. I have lived in the United States 12 years and negotiated a very successful agreement just recently with you and with Canada. I have lived in China as an academic, but interacting with the authorities, not China, in Hong Kong mostly, also 1 year in China. So I know the Chinese, I know how they think, I am known by them, I can work with them. And I have done a lot of work with Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, the former Soviet Union countries. So I am known and I know them and I can work with everybody to make my negotiating skills and my knowledge of the system work for their service and try to get this out of the hole where it finds itself. I think I stop here so as to be able to have questions, and I thank you again for having me, and I look forward to hearing from you with your questions. Eric?
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for laying the groundwork so well, and you really laid a lot of very important issues out there, substantively, administratively, process-wise, global politics. We have a lot to chew on here. Thank you for doing that so well. Let me start with a question. You have really, along with your U.S. and Canadian negotiators, cut a Gordian knot, if you will, of North American trade by bringing USMCA or TMEC into the modern era. It's really been an agreement that has tried to understand where our local populations are, where the popular mood is to try to integrate trade innovations, but also the public mood, which is a very complicated moment. And I wonder, extrapolating from that and building into the global space, if you were the Director General today of the WTO facing a global pandemic of COVID, would there be a way from your perspective, from the WTO perspective, to show the global relevance of the WTO to the people who currently need help? And what I'm trying to get at here is the very complicated nature of the politics behind trade, because trade is a very technical issue. Some people think it's, a four-letter word. They don't understand it, what have you, but it affects all of us. It affects all of our lives directly and relevantly. But how can we show that in a more concrete way, particularly during a time of pandemia and crisis? And I wonder if you have some thoughts on that, and then we'll begin to open the questions queue.
Thank you, Eric. Well, the first thing is that it is a misconception that the only thing that has not worked are the actual negotiations. There's another very important area where the WTO and those who speak for the WTO have not done a sufficiently good job. And this is in arousing public interest in the WTO, explaining why it is very important. For example, if we didn't have WTO, it would have been very tempting for the United States, for example, remember where we came from. It was President Trump saying the worst treaty ever, the NAFTA, and I want to get out of it because of his unhappiness with the movement of factories to Mexico and to Canada, in particular in the car industry and also in the steel industry. So I wouldn't be surprised if we were to run the thought exercise of negotiating this NAFTA 2, this USMCA, in the absence of WTO. It would have been very tempting for the United States to say, okay, we negotiate this treaty, but the car industry is out of it. We cannot have it. Why? Well, because it is politically very delicate for us. We need to run our own policy. And the only reason why that was not even mentioned, or I suppose one reason, not the only reason, one reason why that was not even mentioned or suggested was that it is perfectly illegal in the WTO. The main reason why under the pandemic things have not gone a lot worse, both on closing markets and on discrimination between markets, which is also very tempting, is WTO. And then forget the pandemic. Just looking at the last 26 years, the hottest areas of contention between countries are, well, many, I cannot exclude any, there are many difficult areas on trade, but one very difficult area is rules, subsidies, and anti-dumping. I tell you, when we were closing, because I was a negotiator, when we were closing the creation of WTO, people think that the most difficult thing was agriculture. It wasn't. That was the headlines. It was very difficult. So was intellectual property. But the most difficult was anti-dumping, even though that was the United States negotiating with Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore, mainly. Now imagine if it is with China, which is so much bigger and so much more distant from Western practices in terms of listing companies and behavior and whatever. Okay? So it is the WTO that has held us together, and it is in the WTO that we have substantive obligations on dumping and on subsidies, and not in the regional agreements. Because you cannot commit with Mexico and Canada, or with the United States and Canada in the case of Mexico, not to have a subsidy and not commit it with the rest of the world. There's no way you can not have the subsidy for South America and not have the subsidy for North America and yes, have the subsidy for South America. So these huge areas of rules are ruled only by WTO. So the first thing that I would do if I am DG, or one thing to be done from day one, is to seek to restore the understanding on WTO and the importance of WTO by really playing a big number of, in Davos or in organizations like the ICC in Paris or you people, Council of the Americas and American Society, speaking to the public around the world. I believe a major obligation of the WTO Director General and of the system more generally is to inform, to educate, to arouse interest and support. That's the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say, because the question was, how would you tackle trying to bring people together? The second thing that I would say is to start creating confidence that you can do good things at WTO. In no time, quickly, but start getting confidence by doing useful work on the coming out from the pandemic. And there's a lot that the WTO can do on coming out of the pandemic, both in terms of exchange of notifications, a market of information that is systematized and made available to all the countries so that our private sectors in each country can see whether they have any disconnects in their production chain with the opening upstream where they want to buy parts or minerals and downstream where they want to sell. So all those disconnects will only be found through failure to coordinate when we reopen. But WTO can play a major role in helping countries to do a good job, not such an uncoordinated job. So that's an easy job to do, but an intensive job that is necessary, and also to develop a code of good practice on pandemics for the future, including access to medicines, but I will not go into that now, and to push with negotiations, the negotiations that are already close to conclusion, push them harder so that we reach conclusion, so that we come to the ministerial conference that WTO is holding, hopefully, in 2021, June, with an agenda of new areas for movement. And the common denominator on all that is to begin to restore the main commodity that has been lost in the system, that was extremely available, plentiful when we were negotiating WTO, which was no easier than now. It was very difficult to negotiate dumping and agriculture and all that. It was very difficult. But we had a common currency called trust. There was a basic trust between the major negotiators. Now, in negotiating the NAFTA too, it was extremely difficult. But I knew that Bob Lighthizer would never betray me or lie. He would play tough, he played tough, and we all had to do the same, but we were on the same boat, and also with Deputy Prime Minister Freeland from Canada. We're on the same boat. We knew that we had to find a way to square that difficult circle for both our countries, for the three countries. And this common sense of partnership, almost of destiny. You have to satisfy the US constraints. I have to satisfy Mexico, but we are in this together. That is completely missing. So we need to create this trust. And I think that through the public acts and public action and presence and insistence and going out and early results, we will begin to build that. And that's very much my central objective. In all this, of course, the private sector is another major absentee in the WTO. In the NAFTA, a major reason why we managed to create the consensus or the sufficient support for massive majorities to approve the treaty or the agreement in the three countries was the formidable participation of the private sector. The organization that the private sector created in the United States, with more than 300 umbrella organizations organized in a very complex edifice, same in Mexico, same in Canada. There's none of that in Geneva. In my days in Geneva, negotiating WTO, there was not 1 week when I didn't have one or two top American businessmen in my office as the humble ambassador from Mexico to find out or to lobby. Now, there's not one businessman pretty much to be found in Geneva or around. They're in Zurich doing business, but not in Geneva. So it's all those factors. We have to work on this together, Eric.
Yeah, that's really interesting, your last point in particular, and I think that speaks to a real role and opportunity for the folks on this line, but also the private sector generally. Thank you for those comments. Also, you know, your thoughts about the state of global trade today is so much more complicated than when the WTO was first set up. You mentioned two issues: digital trade, which didn't even exist, and China, which did exist, but in a very different form, which has become a complete, very major player in global trade, obviously. And I'm not sure the system has fully absorbed China in a way that is adequate, or at least comfortable for many around the world. It's a very complicated issue. Thank you for those comments. Very well made. If you can't tell, I'm a strong supporter of the WTO myself, and so I fully believe in the connectivity issue that you have laid out. We do have several questions.
But I hope you're also a strong supporter of this particular candidate.
I can only speak on my personal behalf, Mr. Ambassador. And we are on the record, so
That's more than enough. That's more than enough. Thank you.
We are hosting you, Mr. Ambassador. So, although we are also hosting Ambassador Lighthizer from USTR, as well as Christopher Freeland from Canada too. So come back for those of you who want to hear them as well. Let's open it up to the questions. We do have several. What we're going to do is we're going to open your microphone, not the video, but just the microphone, but you will be asked to ask the question. We're going to start with Laura Dockner from Merck. So Laura, to you, please open your mic and the floor is yours.
Hi, sorry for that. Hi, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Laura Dachner, and I'm with Merck, known as MSD outside of the US and Canada. I have a question for you, Mr. Ambassador, and I'm sorry it doesn't relate to the WTO, but before I go with the question, I want to tell you that I served at the WTO with the mission of Costa Rica a long time ago. And it's an amazing organization that we should definitely try to strengthen. And I wish you a lot of success on your candidacy. So, Mr. Ambassador, my question regards COFEPRIS. As you're aware, COFEPRIS regulates such a big percentage of the Mexican economy. And I want to ask you, how do you think we could work bilaterally to strengthen and enhance COFEPRIS so that the agency really becomes an enabler of trade instead of a hinder for bilateral trade? I will appreciate very much, your thoughts on that. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, it's not for me to comment extensively. I work for one government agency right now, even though I want to work for the world in WTO. It's not for me to criticize other government agencies. It is a challenge. We are making really strong efforts led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, led also by the Ministry of the Economy, which is now in charge of administration of the USMCA, in dialogue with all the agencies on what regulatory changes are necessary and appropriate. You have to work also with the private sector. As I said, the private sector in Mexico has been and continues to be now extremely well organized. It was not so well organized in relation to trade during most of the life of NAFTA. It got very well organized 6 years ago to support the NAFTA exercise. We called on them and they responded and became very well organized in the negotiations that we just concluded. But this time we told them, you cannot go to sleep after the negotiations are over. You need to be constantly there, supporting the government, demanding better results from the government. You have to be our guide and our policeman. You have to make sure that we do this as well as we can and we must. So those are my suggestions to work with the lead agencies in Mexico and to work with the private sector and through the private sector in Mexico. Things are falling into place, I think, nicely, and we have made legal changes very extensively, even after the entry into force of the NAFTA, supplementary of the USMCA, supplementary to the basic changes necessary. And we are going to continue to go in this direction. The regulatory dimension is very much work in progress. I think they have made a great progress, but it's not for me to lead them. It's not the position I'm being able to concentrate on now.
Our next question comes from Maria Luisa Boyce with UPS. Maria Luisa, to you.
Thank you so much, Eric and Ambassador. Thank you so much, and I can only say, may the force be with you in the competition, and really appreciated your comments and the knowledge that you have of the WTO. My question is in reference to small businesses, because maybe that's another change that has happened in the past 30 years. Small businesses are now playing more a role on international trade. But all international trade regulations really were built in mind for larger businesses and larger volume. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how do you see the WTO being able to enable small businesses to enter international trade to help more domestic economies, because I think that's something that can help with the reputation, right, of the WTO. And within the small businesses, women entrepreneurship has been another topic that keeps coming up. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And thank you again for joining us, and Eric for having this event.
Thank you, Maria Luisa. Even though your question is directed squarely at the international scene and the WTO, let me answer by referring back to the USMCA, because one area that I'm very proud of the USMCA is that we developed in the USMCA a whole chapter on SMEs. Why did we do that? Well, because it is a very common call around the world. I cannot imagine there is as much as one country where the issue has not come up, that international trade, because of the continuing greater opening of all the economies around the world and the better availability of information, you know what people in New York consume, even if you are in Mongolia or in South Africa. You know what's going on in Korea and in Chile. And the transportation is cheaper. So as a result of all that, the marketplace is increasingly global. And it's not surprising that the stakes go more and more under the control of bigger and bigger companies that can export from Finland to Brazil or from Egypt to Japan or the converse. So there have been calls for more support to small and medium enterprises that in many cases have fallen out of this ability to capture a fair part of the benefits. So in the USMCA negotiations, aware of this necessity our countries have, and it was very much a Mexico-led part, but very, very much welcomed by the United States and by Canada, we created a chapter that creates policy space to facilitate governments helping firms in a sector, for example, to collect their actions so that they borrow money, they do their financing together, a syndicated loan. Because if they go into a single loan, they become much more trustworthy, and the loan is a bigger operation. It'll be for $50 million instead of being for $1 million, for example, and the financial conditions will be cheaper. So it's good for them. And the same, you can create policy space in the procurement, in the purchases, or in the sales. You can create conditions under which you can help them to create a brand that has 20 owners behind it. So these are things that are for governments to decide and to promote. And the main thing that is needed now is a good industrial policy of a non-distortionary kind, a promotional industrial policy to help industry benefit in your country, in my country, in every country. But we have created this policy space. I very much hope that that kind of thing we can take a lead from that and perhaps develop similar ideas in the WTO. That's very much needed. There are many countries around the world that are far from the conditions that Mexico faces. Small countries like in Central America, or much smaller countries like Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean, or Mauritius in Africa. So these are economies that really have no way to compete unless you give them policy space, and we need to work on that.
Mr. Secretary, you referenced in your initial comments the challenge, I'm not sure you used that word, but the issues between the United States and China. And even though it's not certainly a Latin America issue, it does affect our entire hemisphere, no question about it. And several questions have come in based on that. So let me consolidate them all into one and simply ask you, if you were the head of the WTO at this point, what suggestions might you offer to try to reduce the tensions between the U.S. and China, particularly on the trade side, where there is certainly a mandate for the WTO, but also based on your experience both in the United States and also in China, which is something that not a lot of people can boast. You know both of our societies quite well. Are there insights, are there learnings that you would be able to bring to this particular job to reduce what are really global trade tensions manifested in the U.S.-China bilateral relationship?
That's certainly quite correct. I mean, the scale of operation, the size of the United States and of China, each one is such that any friction between the two has to have gigantic repercussions for everybody around the world. I think it's no secret that many countries have issues to understand how China operates, issues with the way the pervasive presence of the government in the machinery, in the production machinery, state-owned enterprise and so on. There are strong calls for greater transparency by many countries. And as recently as I think, I'm not sure if it's this morning or yesterday, it's a coincidence, I'm sorry, but I published an article that I recommend to you in the chief English language international newspaper of the Communist Party of China. It's called China Daily. It's a newspaper in China. It's a respected newspaper, of course, controlled by the government, but it has a huge circulation. It's a gigantic newspaper. And I just published, maybe today or yesterday, an article whose title is Mutual Benefit, Mutual Need. China should make more efforts to ensure that the WTO overcomes its current paralysis. So I'm inviting China to make its contribution. At the same time, I think the rest of the world needs to engage China and engage each other, because not all the issues are with China. The appellate body is basically a rift between the United States and Europe. And that's a major issue. But in general, the West needs to engage China in negotiations and then to see where they can go. The United States, Japan, and Europe have been developing ideas on how to work on industrial subsidies and on state-owned enterprises. It's not for me to judge what will be possible to negotiate. It's for them to negotiate with China. What I can say is that all of them will have in me a forceful Director General that will be honestly seeking movement and seeking reapproachment between the sides, seeking movement forward. And that's what I would say. As for the rest of the world, I believe that I look at it from our perspective in Mexico. You know that many people have suggested that the frictions between the United States and China are good for Mexico, because some international companies, American companies in China or German companies in China, or even some Chinese companies in China might decide to set up shop elsewhere, and that could be Mexico, to tap the US market, given that directly things are not going well. Or also that the big tariffs on China create a competitive advantage for exports from Mexico. All that may be true, but the reality is that for Mexico, there's no alternative more desirable than having a more harmonious relationship between its chief trading partner, more than 80% is the United States, but our second trading partner globally is China. And China is a major engine for growth globally. So we very much want the problems to be resolved, and because that leads to more growth and a better condition for the world economy. So in terms of preference, that's where I stand, and I think everybody around the world should stand. And in terms of policies, I believe that there should be a movement by China, but negotiation by the rest, and counting on this proven facilitator to help in that process.
Thank you very much. I know that we are at our appointed time, and there are several questions that have also come in that I'm afraid we won't get to, but I wonder, Mr. Secretary, if you have a final 30 seconds or 1 minute closing arguments that you would like to make. Now would be the time to do it, I think, in the context of just wrapping things up.
Well, back to what I said at the beginning, we are facing a real edge of the cliff in the international economy. I don't have much fears that the WTO will cease to exist because governments are not very good at closing organizations. We create them, and then even some that I could mention are probably on the limit of being not very useful, continue to exist and to draw salaries. But what I do see as very likely can easily happen is the WTO becoming increasingly irrelevant and even terminally irrelevant. And that'll be a tremendous disaster for the United States and for everybody else, also for China. That's why I am confident that things can be done, because China, more than anybody else, depends on WTO. Imagine the hostility that will be unleashed if there is no WTO, given that there's so much friction around the world. But also, for the United States, WTO is desirable. And I think there's no better way than to engage with I don't want to say adversaries, they're not adversaries, to counterparts, to other countries. Engage with them and resolve the issues. China has faced 44 disputes in WTO. This in 19 years in succession. 44 means that with each dispute lasting several years, it means that at any one point in time, they have had half a dozen disputes going on. That's the way to engage them. And we can re-strengthen the dispute settlement system and negotiate rules among everybody and with them. A strong WTO is in the interest of everybody. And this particular election is of the utmost importance because a selection based on political correctness or political considerations that doesn't go for the best candidate might be exactly what the WTO needs to become precisely irrelevant, to continue the downward path. So I wish you all luck, and I wish myself luck in that endeavor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And we wish you luck as well. And truthfully, in my personal view, it would be a tragedy if the WTO went into irrelevance. It is a necessary institution. And in fact, it should be amplified, in my view, and it does require a strong leader to do that. Thank you for your comments. This is very well taken, very well made. What a fascinating conversation. There is so much more we could get to if we had time. Regrettably, we do not. We thank again our sponsors. We thank again all of you for joining us for this session. Please come back on Thursday at 11 o'clock Washington time when we host Larry Kudlow, the Director of the National Economic Council at the White House, for another Washington Conference on the Americas session. This concludes our public session with Secretary Seade, and we thank all of you for joining us.
Goodbye. Thank you.